So let's see. So yes, information about previous events can be found on our website. Tonight we are joined by 3 speakers: Joan Passy, Christy Margrave, Ruth Beanstalk, and Alec. And I'll introduce them in turn ahead of their papers. This theme is Gothic Environments. A very capacious theme, but a very timely theme as well. I'm going to pause slightly because a few people are joining us as we come in, which is great. And before we get started, I should say we are recording this event, and we will record the Q&A as well. So bear that in mind when it comes to asking questions. You might prefer to have your camera off. We're very happy to read out questions on your behalf. Feel free to comment in the chat as we go this evening. If you preface your comment with a Q, a letter Q, we'll know that that's a specific question you would like us to ask out later. We're going to have the 3 papers in turn. We're going to have questions and comments once we've heard from all of our speakers tonight. So before I introduce the speakers, I want to introduce the Gothic Women team. So this is a collaborative project, and we're joined by the whole team apart from Anna Mercer, who's taking a well-deserved holiday. So in turn, we have Deborah Russell, who's going to give you a little wave. She's based at the University of York. We're also joined by Laura Kirkley, who is zooming in from sunny Newcastle. She's based at Newcastle University. And also, who else? Lauren Nixon is joining us here, who is the Buzz-funded Communications Fellow. And you would have spoken with her for any communication regarding our events. So this is a series of online seminars. We've been running them for quite a while now. I forget when we started, but we had quite a few of these events. I think all of them have been recorded. We're building up next year, 2023, which we're calling the Year of Gothic Women, because it is a year in which we will celebrate or commemorate at least 2 major events. 1823 is a big year for Mary Shelley. Her name is attached to Frankenstein. Also, it's the year in which Anne Radcliffe died, 1823. So we're going to commemorate, not celebrate, commemorate those events next year with a large international conference, which will take place at Dundee in Scotland. Information about that will be forthcoming, including a save the date notification via our social media. That's enough from me. And I should introduce myself, actually. I'm Daniel Cook, and I'm based at Dundee. So our first speaker tonight is Joan Passy, and I'm just going to pull up on my screen a short biography as she gets ready. She's going to be sharing a PowerPoint presentation, so we need to make sure that's working. So Joan Passy is a lecturer in English at the University of Bristol, where she specializes in 19th century coasts and seascapes and the Gothic from the 18th century to the present. Her monograph, Cornish Gothic, is upcoming with University of Wales Press. And through the British Library's Tales of the Weird series, she has an anthology, Cornish Horrors, and a co-edited anthology, Our Haunted Shores, which was released just last week, hot off the press. She is a BBC AHRC New Generation thinker and has spoken on BBC Radio 4 and at the Hay Festival. She is the Wilkie Collins Fellow, Edge Hill University, and co-founder of the Haunted Shores Network. Over to you, Joan.
Right, can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up. And you can see my slides, but not my notes, right?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm obsessed with the Gothic Women Project and everything you do. It's a real privilege. And I'm going to be talking about some of those figures that you named in that introduction there today in a presentation called Instant Death on Every Wave Appears, the Gothic Seascapes of Charlotte Smith, Anne Radcliffe and Mary Shelley. And I've got my email address and my Twitter handle there. If you would like to contact me, please feel free to do so. You might notice that that title is from Homer, but it is used as a little prefix in the introduction to chapter 13 of Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. And it's useful for me because I'm very much thinking transhistorically about the way that seascapes manifest in different terms throughout Gothic fiction. Across its, it's 4 centuries that we recognise from the 18th century onwards, but also its earlier precursors. So I'm going to be thinking a little bit today, here we go, about what we mean when we talk about ecologies in the Romantic imagination, when we have long had an established body of work noting the centrality of the natural world to Romantic poetry. and literature. The term ecology wasn't coined until 1866 by Ernst Haeckel, a German zoologist, to describe the economies or interactions between living systems within and making up an environment. Yet it is clear that this consideration of the complex interactivity of organisms and natural spaces and the importance of studying and reflecting on those interactivities comes considerably earlier. So I'm proposing that the seascape, and I'm focusing on the coast here, perhaps a touch misleadingly, in late 18th and early 19th century women's Gothic writing provides an avenue for considering earlier notions of ecological thinking and embryonic environmental awareness as the relationship between humankind and the natural world shifts and becomes increasingly strained as a result of myriad cultural and historical factors, including the rise of industrial capitalism, the transatlantic slave trade, and imperialism, all of which centre on the necessity of waterways, all of which rely upon maritime expansion and technological development, and all of which demonstrate that our understanding of empire and environment is inextricable from our understanding of water in the cultural consciousness. When we think of nature or ecology, we might think green rather than blue, but my work seeks to recenter the sea as an ideal site for reflecting on the natural world in the literary and social imaginary. And I'm thinking about this in two different ways. So firstly, I propose that recentering the sea destabilizes the kind of tertiary thinking and serves as a tonic to anthropocentrism. The sea is uninhabitable to us as humans. It's something we rely on, but something ultimately inhospitable and alien. Yet water makes up 90% of habitats of living things and covers 70% of the surface of the planet. In order to fracture the imposed hierarchy of our so-called dominion over the natural world, a framework which has and continues to enable colonial extractivist practices and fuel climate change, where the exploitation of people is mapped onto the exploitation of the natural world, then we need to decenter ourselves, crucially. The second way I think about the sea as productive as a site for literary inquiry is that I propose that recentering the sea provides a new material medium for considering the language we use to articulate our experience of the natural world, that the surfaces and depths, abysses, liquidities, flowiness, instabilities, unknowableness of the sea all provide an alternate poetics to the green land-based pastoral idyll, enabling a challenge to rationality and a framework for reassessing scale and sublimity in literary terms. So why Haeckel didn't coin ecology until 1866, and I'm looking at authors writing significantly earlier, Buffon had defined what we have come to know of as the Anthropocene, or the geological age where humankind is the greatest driving force behind planetary change, in his Epochs of Nature back in 1778. This is one of the earliest secular models time, as Noah Herringman describes how Buffon uses inscription as a metaphor for describing the Earth's history. Writing then becomes a means for imagining the way in which we write our presence upon the Earth, alter the world around us, as well as becoming a vital medium through which we communicate our shifting relationship with the world. In telling stories, we create marks, and this in itself is a useful framework considering the important role that literature and environmental humanities can play in tackling climate crisis. While there is established work on romantic eco-criticism by a number of scholars, and I'm happy to share bibliography after this if useful, I'm intrigued by how this body of work might be confronted from a Gothic perspective. In their introduction to Eco-Gothic, Andrew Smith and William Hughes note the important and recognised synergies between Romanticism and Gothicism, and how up until recently a consideration of nature in regards to those synergies has been somewhat overlooked. They emphasise that the Gothic is not only an offshoot, but that both fields share a language, and that Gothic ecological awareness has its roots in these romantic movements, rather than being a recent response to climate trauma. Still, much of this criticism has been green, conceiving of the forest in particular as a fertile Gothic site, as per the groundbreaking work of Elizabeth Parker. How then might the blue humanities, as a field within the environmental humanities, how is the blue humanities engaged with Gothic criticism, if at all, and vice versa? The blue humanities refers to the productive interaction of humanities subjects with the seascape, using methodologies from the arts and humanities to interrogate representations and experiences of seas, oceans, coasts and waterways, and was coined by Steve Mentz in his work on the early modern period. Since then, figures like Emily Alder and Jimmy Packham have been pivotal in driving the idea of a maritime Gothic mode. While this maritime Gothic is a recent turn, and blue humanities scholars have engaged perhaps less with the Gothic than vice versa, a particular language or rhetoric recurs in the blue humanities with which we might be familiar. One needs only scratch the surface of blue humanities criticism to find it rife with surfaces and depths and abysses and otherness and anxiety and fears and dissolutions and drownings and repressions. For example, in Elizabeth Lowry's Submarine Futures of the Anthropocene, they describe the oceanic turn in critical studies, a shift, quote, from a long-term concern with mobility across transoceanic surfaces to theorizing oceanic submersion, thus rendering vast oceanic space into ontological place, end quote. Crucially, they note that Caribbean authors and scholars like Derek Walcott have had an oceanic poetics long before this oceanic turn to which the blue humanities owes a tremendous debt. For example, Caribbean writers have noted the ways in which the Atlantic seabed serves as a graveyard and memorial of the transatlantic slave trade. De Lowry talks about the sea having the capacity to memorialize, to collapse linear time, to signify the return of the oppressed, to provide a space for considering violences and disaster, to consider reanimation, degeneration, using the example of Jason DeCare Taylor's vicissitudes from 2006, sunk off the coast of Grenada in the world's first underwater sculpture park. Visitors to the sculpture, note De Lowry, refer to it as creepy and spooky, prompting them to reflect on the productivity of spooky in discussing our experience of climate crisis and memorialization. With this vocabulary so thoroughly entrenched in Gothic criticism, which, while itself new, is still older than the blue humanities, though only by about 10 or 20 years, which is in itself telling, this vocabulary is so well worked and rehearsed and dismantled in application to 4 centuries of literary output in the field that we work in. Thus, it might be productive to turn this lens to the blue humanities and interrogate potential productive intersections between the two methodologies. And I'm just going to go through some case studies quickly for you. I have plenty more, but I'll try to be swift. So I'm going to be opening with some of Charlotte Smith's sonnets. These are from the Elegiac Sonnets of 1784 to 1812, with new poems added to new editions. And I begin here with the sea view, because I think this is a fantastic example of a very unromantic severance of humankind with the natural world that characterizes Smith's depiction of seascapes. She has this beautiful, tranquil representation of a sea, even over the rustic's breast a joy serene, when like dark plague spots by the demon shed, charged deep with death, upon the waves far seen move the far freighted ships, and fierce and red flash their destructive fires. The mangled dead and dying victims then pollute the flood. Ah, thus man spoils glorious works with blood. Humans are dislocated from the natural world, but this isn't in a superior way. Humans are instead seen as a plague or a scourge in a way that I think suggests an embryonic ecological consciousness. The sea is not welcoming grave here, but something that is ruined by the presence of men, even in death. In Written on the Sea Shore, this sense of a Gothic fragmentation, which, as we know, is antithetical to a more romantic conception of a harmonious relationship with the natural world, runs through these descriptions of the coast as a literal space, as a threshold, as fragment and fracture and tempest. Crucially, she imagines herself here as shipwrecked, which recurs in maritime Gothic literature across the 18th and 19th century, where the woman's body is often represented as a wreck, as broken cargo, as property shattered by man's folly against the rocks. This is my favourite of Smith's sonnets because the title is absurd and it brings me joy, where the poetess imagines herself upon a cliff top where she has been cautioned to avoid, and in seeing a hermit in the caves, rather than pitying him or despairing, she envies him because he and this natural space are represented of a wilderness that exists outside of the confines of society. There is a freedom here in this untamed space of wilderness where there is a dislocation crucially from an Enlightenment rationality. This is perhaps Smith's most famous sonnet from Beachy Head, one of the most famous coastal poems likely of all time. And here we have this sense of a colonial reading of the coastal space, as providing space to consider the sea as the coast as entrance to the sea, as a place that is simultaneously rife with opportunity, but also vulnerable to reverse invasion. So the sea is a barrier and an entry point. In an evening walk by the seaside, we get significantly less blood and gore and madness, but I think we also get a really intriguing mingling and overlaying and combining a notion of amongness, which again, I propose appeals to this embryonic ecological imagining of the interconnected of things, of the smallness of the self amongst the natural world, which is exaggerated by the cycles of the moon and the tide towards the sonnet's close, as well as to the inevitability of all things being washed away where water encircles. This consciousness of erosion of the self of society, represented through the erosion of unstable coastal land, is made most explicit in this strange sonnet where coffins and bones are washed out of a cliffside cemetery. People's bones are left to bleach on the beach, intermingled with flotsam and jetsam, somewhat diminished, yet also somewhat relocated within the natural order of things, as the ritual ceremonial burial is exchanged for a more chaotic reunion with the ebb and flow of the world. Here again, we get this repeated concept of envy emerging as the tides of the sea articulate the poet's desire for death, and the coast as this liminal space representing a threshold where one can be closest to death, to come in contact with the dead, and can confront death as a sort of site of psychic catharsis. This one, I think, huge vapours brewed above the cliffed shore, is fantastically representative of the way in which Charlotte Smith's seascapes are loud. They are chaotic soundscapes that overwhelm the senses. And I think this appeals to Isabella van Elfrin's claim that the Gothic is a fundamentally sonic genre. And I don't quite have time to go through this in detail, but I do have some emerging work looking at the importance of the sonic seascape in Gothic women's writing that I'm happy to discuss more in the questions if you are so inclined. My work on the sonic seascape has its origins in my study of Anne Radcliffe. Anne Radcliffe currently engages with the sublimity of the seascape. Her seas are tumultuous and unfathomable and beautiful yet violent, and they provide scope for reflection on the awesome terror of the sublime, which, as we can see, has happened in Smith's sonnets as well. This idea of the coast being this vital space in which women are free to think. In The Mysteries of Udolpho upon a Cliff Top, St. Foix reflects on the James Beattie poem The Minstrel. What dreadful pleasure there to stand sublime, like the shipwrecked mariner on desert coast. And this precedes Coleridge's own hallucinogenic Gothic shipwrecked mariner by 3 years. Shipwrecks crop up again in Radcliffe's poetical works. In her poem The Shipwreck, death shrieks upon the gale, ending on the note of fear. In The Fishers, Radcliffe ruminates on the outposts of shores whose eyes look down on desolation, pain, shipwreck and death. Shakespeare's Cliff, too, looks out from a precipice and marvels at the sublimity of the ocean's depths. For fearful sweet it is to stand on some tall point between earth and heaven. For Radcliffe too, the coast is a threshold, but it is also a portal into the fantastical. And I'm reminded somewhat of Edgar Allan Poe's Manuscript in a Bottle, where the whirling sea pool becomes this chasm or doorway into another world. The voice of the spirits rising sweet and low seem to be emerging from another realm. And so much of Radcliffe's work is interested in veiling, in the faint membrane separating one world from another, fantasy from reality, truth from lies, which we could even read in abject terms. And these uncontrollable waters come to embody Radcliffe's subtle undermining of structures of authority, where the ship represents humankind's dominion over nature, the triumph of technology and rationality, and even comes to represent the state as a whole, and it's conquering, it's being absorbed back into the abysses of the sea, becomes part of Radcliffe's nuanced social commentary and resistance to authority. Speaking of resistance to authority, just going to wrap up now with one more example for all you. Obviously, we have to end on Mary Shelley when Frankenstein is oft forgotten, perhaps, and not by me, I talk about it all the time, but Frankenstein functions in many ways as a travel narrative, opening and closing with an oceanic excursion with shipboard life. And in Frankenstein, the monster is the victim, is a product of a vain effort to control the uncontrollable, to tame and harness natural forces, parallels there with images of shipwreck used in maritime Gothic literature. It's a novel that could only be born in the midst of profound anxiety over progress and modernity in the natural world. When Mary Shelley was writing, Britain was expanding, reaching tendrils across the sea, discovering and conquering and pillaging lands new to them but ancient to others. And all this was only made possible by expanding maritime technologies. The movement from sail to steam, from wooden hulls to iron ones, meant that more people and more things could be moved more quickly across the seas, enabling the expansion of empires and the development of global trade routes. Humanity was striving in the face of tempestuous waters, resisting movement, and in doing so were creating something horrific, an empire born of violence and ambition. The scientist Victor Frankenstein is then haunted and pursued by his own creation across oceans and seas. And here is an extract of the Doctor's reflection as he stares across the waves from this desolate and appalling landscape, Orkney, and where he regards the beach of the sea, which I almost regarded as an insuperable barrier between me and my fellow creatures. The sea again is a fitting site for reflection for a society undergoing rapid change, accentuating otherness, a marker of distance, a space to reflect on responsibility and the consequences of our meddling with natural forces beyond our understanding. While written in 1818, there is space here perhaps for us to reflect on our own depths of despair in the midst of climate change. What is plastic pollution but an artificial lumbering green monster of our own creation, birthed to solve a problem only to come back to haunt us, as described by Emily Alder in her thesis on underwater plastic Frankensteins. Frankenstein was born on a bank, not of a sea, but of a lake, in a year without summer. Mary Shelley now is interred by the sea, with her parents and Percy Bysshe Shelley near their home in Bournemouth. P.B. Shelley died at sea, his bones burnt on the beach. He was moved to Bournemouth from Rome, where his gravestone bore Ariel's song from The Tempest. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. How then can the Gothic provide a new way for us to read seas, both rich and strange? And I have some questions here, which we can come back to at the end, but for now I'll leave you with that and a cheeky plug for our book. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm so looking forward to the next presentations.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was so rich. There'll be many, many questions coming, I'm sure. But we'll save questions for the end. We're going to jump straight to our second speaker now. This is Christy Margrave, and I'll introduce her as she gets ready. I should also say, by the way, you might want to toggle your settings on your screen so that you can toggle between speaker's view and gallery view and things like that. So Christy then. So Dr. Christy Margrave is a lecturer in French and interpreting at the University of East Anglia and a president of Women in French, Australia. She published her first monograph in 2019, Margrave, Christy, Writing the Landscape, Exposing Nature in French Women's Fiction, 1789 to 1815. She has also published on 18th and 19th century French women's writing in the journals Essays in French Literature and Culture and Women's Writing. She has also published articles on post-colonial eco-criticism in Caribbean and Indian Ocean literature with the journals Bismuth and the Journal for Romance Studies. So that's 2019, 2022, respectively. She has also recently had an article accepted for the Palgrave Handbook of Transnational Women's Writing in the long 19th century. Over to you, Christy.
Just checking that I'm not muted. Good. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to speak here as well. It's great to speak alongside people who work on Anglophone writers. I don't get to do this very often, and which is a real shame because actually there's so much crossover, with what we've just heard and what we're about to hear that, it's a real shame I don't take advantage of this kind of opportunity more often, really. So thank you very much for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I should start by saying that I'm not a specialist in Gothic fiction. I noticed that there are one or two, or a few actually, specialists in French Gothic fiction who are here. So shout out to all of those. And I hope that I do a certain amount of justice to what I'm about to say. This paper addresses seemingly Gothic elements in non-Gothic novels. So I've been working to shed light on novels of forgotten French women writers from the late 18th and early 19th century for a few years. They're forgotten now, yet they were the most popular of their day. Largely, they write sentimental novels, and I've examined how they craft natural landscapes as settings to expose and comment on the problems that patriarchal society caused women to experience in France during this period. In addition, showing how those novelists employ the same descriptions of nature to highlight women's responses to the pain and frustration that such social issues provoke for them. And I've looked at the expectations of and restrictions on women throughout this period regarding things like arranged and forbidden marriages, demands on women to become ideal mothers, the ways in which female protagonists showed rebellion against those expectations, often through madness, death, or suicide. And ultimately, what I've been trying to argue is that natural landscape is very far from being a casually chosen backdrop for writers like Madame Cottin, who I've decided to focus on today. Rather, an escape into nature, which is given to their female protagonists, becomes a means to expose and confront the everyday reality and suffering faced by women in the revolutionary decade and the Napoleonic era. And Joan just described, I've written in the margins here, a space in which women can think, and that's precisely what natural spaces become in these novels. They also demonstrate a certain commitment to environmental praxis and to some extent prefigure Darwin in discussions of whether a species is more successful if it adapts to the environment around it or whether it adapts the environment to itself. And they discuss this with regard to women adapting to oppressive environments or attempting to force the environment to adapt to them. So why am I here? The sentimental novels of French women writers of the 1790s and early 1800s include several ingredients which can easily be considered Gothic. And it's not really surprising, to be honest, that Gothic elements should permeate sentimental novels. I mean, the two genres gained popularity at the same time. They both prioritize emotion over reason and rationalism. They both frequently deal with death, sorrow, and loss. But if these novels are not Gothic from the outset, then what elements of Gothic fiction are nonetheless present and why? Well, we can start with the very notion of marginalized women, which, as you all know, is a theme common to Gothic novels. Frequently, Gothic fictions, sorry, there's Madame Cottin for you, sees heroines who seek both to appease and to free themselves from the excesses of male and patriarchal dominance. And we also note that the Gothic has long confronted the cultural problem of gender distinctions, including what they mean for Western structures of power and how boundaries between the genders might be questioned. And the info in those two quotes is in fact imperative for understanding the novels of someone like Sophie Cottin. Looking at how she addresses gender power structures and the ways in which women are often caught in untenable situations, we frequently see ourselves examining her depiction of what I've called here deathscapes. And that brings me to another aspect which her novels have in common with Gothic fiction, the blurring of the lines between the worlds of the living and the worlds of the dead. A borderline between life and death appears frequently in sentimental fiction. Now, it may not be in the form of a resurrected body or a character who's neither truly dead nor truly alive, but that blurred line between life and death is nonetheless present. It most often takes the form of a visible space in which the living might visualize death, so something along the lines of what we've just been hearing about, actually, and where the dead may come to influence the living. The term deathscape itself was in fact established by cultural geographers in the 1990s. And those deathscapes include sites of death itself, cemeteries, sites of mourning, memorials constructed for a deceased loved one, etc., etc. And it's a concept which is highly applicable to some of the newly fashionable spaces in the 18th century in which one might contemplate death. So memorial gardens, for example, burials in one's own garden, grave sites, sites of mourning by areas of water. The deathscapes which appear in Madame Cottin's novels are largely tombs and grave sites, often in a garden setting. and they're sites which break down the border between the worlds of living and dead. However, she also employs waterscapes, drawing on common myths of rivers as liminal spaces in order to break down the same barrier. I haven't the time to focus on the waterscapes today, because I've chosen to go with the gardens and the tombs, but I slightly regret that, given what we've just heard, and I'd love to have a chat with Joan later about the blue eco-Gothic.
Christy?
Sorry, Christy, to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We're not seeing the slide advance. Is that
You're not seeing the
okay?
slides? Oh,
No,
sorry.
we're just seeing the title slide.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, let's try.
That's okay. Can you remember which one we got to?
Let's have a look. All right, let's just try again, shall we? All right.
There we go. Perfect.
Perfect. Lovely. Thank you so much for that, Christy.
That's all right. Can you see the quotes on that one now? Is it moving? Yeah.
Yeah,
so those are the quotes I just gave you. So I apologize for that. There's Madame Cotin from earlier. Technology is not my best friend today. I've already had problems with printers. Here we are. So let us start by looking at the tomb in the garden. In Cotin's first two novels, Claire d'Albe from 1799 and Malvina from 1800, the tomb in the garden becomes a space of regained autonomy through rebellion. Claire is caught in a paradox. As Gerald Hoggle has argued, women are the figures most fearfully trapped between contradictory pressures and impulses in the Gothic novel. And this is precisely what we see in Claire d'Albe, whose eponymous heroine must tread the fine line between angel of virtue, that is embodying the perfect model of wifely domesticity, and object of sexual desire. She begins the story as the epitome of wifely virtue, duty-bound to a much older man whom she doesn't love because her own father arranged the marriage. Her virtue, paradoxically, is what makes her such an object of sexual desire to Frédéric, the young man who arrives to live in her husband's house. Claire falls for him and his entreaties, and in an ultimate act of patriarchal rebellion, she abandons her dutiful virtue, betrays her husband, and consummates her love for Frederick on her own father's grave, which happens to be in the garden of her husband's house. She immediately regrets this and wills herself to die. All in a space sort of described, as you can see a little bit here, in the beautiful French countryside with some dying trees who suddenly start to shed their leaves the moment she has all this regret. Her second heroine, has the slide moved on there? Can you see Malvina? Okay. Malvina betrays society's demands, marrying the man forbidden to her. As a result of her supposedly immoral behavior, her adopted daughter is snatched away from her as punishment. And then she's betrayed by her husband, who sleeps with another woman. She rebels the only way that's left open to her, through madness and death. Elaine Showalter has asked, instead of asking if rebellion was mental pathology, we must ask whether mental pathology was in fact suppressed rebellion. Was hysteria a mode of protest for women? And that's basically what happens for Malvina. She retreats to the garden, as you can see in the engraving here, surrounding her house, a garden which had once provided a space of bliss for her newfound marital happiness. Yet now she's descended into insanity and is determined to die. This natural space becomes dark. Her husband Edmund returns home to find that the nature in the garden where she wanders has significantly altered. The trees have lost their foliage, the birds no longer sing, the flowers have disappeared, it's full of piercing cold, we've got the funereal cypress trees and the somber pines, silence of death, and then he falls on top of a stone, which he discovers is a tombstone. Interestingly enough, the tomb is, it's Malvina's tomb, but she's not yet dead. She's had it constructed for herself there in preparation, and she goes to the tomb on a daily basis to await her death. On discovering that events are not Malvina's fault, the society around her attempts to save her. A doctor is summoned, Edmund repents, her daughter is returned to her, but she still chooses to die. According to Elizabeth Bronfen, death ascribes a certain autonomous power to the dying person in this period, since the form of death, which can be shaped by the dying person, comes to determine his or her individuality. And it's a rebellious individuality which marks the deaths of Malvina and Claire d'Albe. And the Gothic aspect of the scene can be seen best in the engraving underneath, in the comment underneath that engraving there, from the original edition of the novel. The almost spectral figure of Malvina appears, asking Edmund, "Who are you? Who are you looking for? Why have you come to disturb the ashes of the dead?" At this point, she's not yet dead, but she considers herself to be so. In Madame Scotin's last two novels, Mathilde, ou Mémoire tirée de l'histoire des croisades from 1805, and Elisabeth, ou Les exilés de Sibérie from 1806, the heroines do not rebel through death. They assume a mantle of power through their interaction with other people's tombs, resuming control of their destiny and of socio-political events, persuading male rulers to bow to their will. And this is what Norigana might describe as the mourner attempting to make reality his or her own again after having been alienated from it by the loss of his or her loved object. For Mathilde and Elisabeth, the graveside visits are where reality is reclaimed by the originally powerless female, and they also reclaim their voice there. Mathilde is set during the Crusades, as you might be able to see from the image there. The English princess Mathilde, sister of King Richard, travels to the Holy Land with Richard and his troops. She falls in love with Malik Adel, who's the brother of the celebrated Saracen leader Saladin. Malik Adel pursues her across the desert, saves her from a band of thieves. He requests that Richard's most trusted soldier, Montmorency, escort her back to the Christian camp, but the escort is attacked. Montmorency dies. Soon after, Richard informs Mathilde that he demands her to marry a French crusader by the name of Lusignan. She's horrified at being forced against her will and silenced by patriarchal power. However, she succeeds in restoring her autonomy and voice. She requests the key to Montmorency's tomb, and this is what we see in the image, the lovely image here painted by Eugénie Servière. She says, "It's near to tombs that one rises above weaknesses and resigns oneself to great sacrifices." And in fact, she does overcome her weakness through this visit, but not in the manner that her brother wants. She gives the key to Malik Adel and meets him in secret at Montmorency's tomb. And she then uses the visit here to declare her love whilst refusing to make love to him and to take decisions about her next moves. And you'll see here that we've got, so Montmorency, I should explain actually, the guy in the tomb there, is both a representative of King Richard's army and a protector and friend to both Mathilde and Malik Adel. So he stands as a bridge between the Christian king's patriarchal oppression and Mathilde's desire for freedom of choice. And it's in the presence of his body that Mathilde uses that bridge to put together a plan to save her from this forced wedding, to bring the camps together, to stop the fighting, to appease Richard, and ultimately to be with the man she loves. Here she finds her resolve, she finds her voice and her ability to take back control. The tomb, as you can see from the image, it doesn't just bridge enemies, it doesn't just bridge living and dead, it also bridges East and West. Eugénie Servière, who she was inspired by Cotin's novel to paint this particular image. And the painting captures perfectly the Orientalism which runs through Cotin's novel, filled with stereotypical romantic imagery of barbarous infidels, sterile deserts, unknowable marriages, exotic strangers in generic Eastern costume. And the only color of the painting appears in Malik Adel's clothing, the red, orange, gold, and blue. They're typical, stereotypical, in fact, of the French romantic depictions of the Orient, such as those by Jérôme Aude de la Croix. The painting underlines how Cotin's novel conjoins two common features of romantic texts and images, and indeed Gothic ones, Orientalism and death, both representative of the beyond. In her effort to create a scene of mysticism which leads to female power. So yet another Gothic trope is present here in her work. What we don't see, unfortunately, with this image is that we have a nice sort of circle within a circle. You have the Oriental figure surrounded by the mausoleum, which in itself is surrounded by the Oriental desert. And we get lengthy descriptions of the unbearable heat of the desert, the oppressiveness of the desert, which is something that I'll look at in a minute. The conjoining of Orientalist imagery and death is also found in her final novel, Elisabeth. The eponymous heroine's family are exiled from Siberia, to Siberia from the native Poland. And the novel follows Elisabeth's epic journey across Russia from Siberia to Moscow to obtain the emperor's pardon for her father. In the early stages of the journey, she's accompanied by a missionary. However, soon he dies and she must continue alone. The mourning that takes place at the missionary's tomb, which is what you can see in the image here, the engraving, the mourning that takes place there it morphs into a period of personal liberation. She undertakes an epic journey, heroic deeds, vital decisions alone in an era in which these were frequently forbidden to women. And in so doing, she wields influential power and she sets socio-political changes in motion. As with Montmorency's tomb in Mathilde, the gravesite in Elizabeth is tinged with Orientalism, as again you can see in the image. The cortege which followed the missionary's coffin was large, this is a quotation. Several sorts of nations were represented, Persians, Turkoman, Arabs escaped from Kyrgyz slavery, end quote. The description of Elizabeth by the side of the tomb of the missionary also resembles Mathilde's argument when wanting to visit Montmorency's tomb. She says, quote, "It's useful to be able to spend several hours meditating between heaven and death. From the tomb there arise thoughts of courage. From heaven there descend consoling hopes. One fears unhappiness less in the place in which you see the end." Mathilde argues that you can overcome weakness and discover your strength at the site of a tomb, a reminder of the transience of life. Elizabeth finds that this border space is one which inspires courage and hope, both of which motivate her to accomplish great achievements and wield great power. So in the last two novels, grave sites become a space where the other is encountered. The living meet the dead, the East meets the West. They're spaces with much less anger, resentment, and rebellion than the earlier novels Claire d'Albe and Malvina. They're spaces which bridge wars and span cultures and pass control and voice and autonomy to female characters. The final Gothic ingredient we might consider when analysing Cotin's novels, is a response to the trauma of the French Revolution. And there's a final quotation there. As Hogel reminds us, the Marquis de Sade, for example, frequent adapter of Gothic devices, saw the Gothic genre as an inevitable product of the revolutionary shocks with which the whole of Europe resounded, because it was able to situate in the land of fantasies the violent challenges to established orders. Cotin herself argued in the preface to Claire d'Albe that she wanted to escape the horrors of the real world through her writing. She says, "Disgust, danger, and fear of the world have created in me the need to retreat into an ideal world." Her family was persecuted, some were even executed. She herself was an émigrée, and she withdraws into her fictional creations to escape the terror, with a capital T, of the real world. Yet, as she does so, she finds herself addressing the oppression of patriarchal society, highlighting the fact that the ideals of the revolution failed women long before they failed men. Furthermore, we can argue that Cotin's later novels, Mathilde and Elizabeth, they both display anti-revolutionary sentiment. They're both full of praise for the chivalry of the nobility. They both place an awful lot of power within religion. They exalt religion. Both the novels place the heroines and the soldiers of the nobility on a pedestal of both religious and moral virtue. And as we know, religion and the nobility were the things that the revolution was trying to overturn. Or some of them anyway. Elizabeth also depicts a call for a successful return from exile, which is something so many French émigrés desired in the wake of the revolution. So ultimately, during her short writing career, she dies very young. Cotin addresses topics such as patriarchal dominance, abuse, anti-revolutionary sentiment, and the roles of men and women, all come together to call for the moral regeneration of society itself in the wake of the revolution. She also turns our attention to the power of women to help in these matters. Her sentimental novels contain many Gothic features, both therefore at the extratextual level of socio-political commentary, as well as the intratextual level of imagery. I'm very sorry I didn't have much more time to talk to you about waterscapes, but hopefully there'll be time to do that in the questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christy. That was wonderful, really, really rich. And there'll be plenty of questions. So let's crack straight on to our third and final speaker. So we head from Norwich to Pennsylvania now, with Ruth Bienstock Adderlich, and I'll just read out her biographical note here. So Ruth Bienstock Adderlich teaches English, American, and biblical literature at Villanova University. Her writing focuses on Gothic reflections of anxieties in the external world. Her most recent work is American Gothic Literature, a thematic study from Mary Rowlandson to Colson Whitehead. She's beginning to explore the interplay between the Gothic mode and biblical literature. Over to you, Ruth. You're currently muted. Perfect.
I did. Anything, feel free to correct me in any technological issues or theoretical ones, whatever you like. So the title of my talk, I'm sorry, I'm not as adept as some of you are. Okay, this is better for me. Can you see me? That's weird. I put myself in speaker, but Daniel, you're there, but that's okay. I don't understand this. All right, never mind. Anyhow, so the title of this talk is Out of the Castle into the Storm, and I'm talking about a different book than we've been discussing so far. A single book by American writer Lydia Millett called A Children's Bible, published 2020. So hot off the presses. I would like to talk a little first about the English tradition and then the American Gothic tradition very briefly. So I'm skimming and I'll be happy to develop any of this conversation in the Q&A. So I'm making general statements, which you feel free to challenge. The English Gothic begins with the flight of the young protagonist, usually from an older, more powerful and male adversary. Although Walpole's Isabella never, Although Walpole's Isabella never escapes the labyrinthine castle and church of Otranto, Anne Radcliffe's heroines do manage to escape the confines of the buildings to get out into the natural world, although nature too offers challenges and obstacles. Just one example of the many, and is a smaller, lesser work of Radcliffe's, but resonance for this. In Radcliffe's Sicilian romance, Julia flees the dangerous castle of her father, only to discover that the world outside is also dominated by the powers of church and state. And Julia also encounters a seascape of beautiful dangers, which I won't post right now. Ironically, Julia herself only finds real security when she inadvertently returns to her father's castle. Thus, while the outside world seems to offer escape to the young protagonists of the Gothic novel, the natural world offers its own form of danger. Yet, although nature and the supernatural frightens the young Gothic protagonist, typically the central catalyst of danger is the evil of the human heart. Now, a quick move to the American Gothic, which takes its cues from the English Gothic. The young country rooted in rebellion, and I was interested in what Christy referred to Sod's comments on the French Revolution. I'd say the same applies to the American Revolution, influencing American literature and American Gothic. The rebellion, the guilty anxieties of what Leslie Fiedler calls parricide, the metaphorical killing of the king, found these American anxieties found meaning in the English Gothic struggle between the old, rich, and powerful aristocrat and the young, good, rebellious protagonist who reappear in the writings of the first American novelist, also the first American Gothic novelist, Charles Brockden Brown, who was writing in the 1790s. His alienated young protagonists illustrate the struggle of their compatriots by working to forge a new identity against the backdrop of old powerful patriarchs figured in America as rich and powerful, although they lacked the trappings of aristocracy. Yet the outer forms of the struggle change. Charles Brockden Brown himself notes in his preface to Edgar Huntley, written 1799, Gothic castles and chimera are the materials usually employed for this end, for creating anxiety and excitement in the reader. But for Brown, the incidents of Indian hostility and the perils of the Western wilderness are far more suitable for a native of America. That is the mysterious, uncharted lands that lie beyond the border of the frontier, and the mysterious, unknowable Native Americans take the place of the Castle of the Ghost as a site and emblem of danger. And it was interesting to me that both Christy and Joan talked about this frontier between the known landscape and the unknown landscape. Joan, especially the coast as the border between known land, unknown, dangerous sea. So the editors of the collection Frontier Gothic assert that, quote, Gothicism must abide on the frontier, whether physical or psychological. The Gothic space is the liminal space, the line between the comfortable known and the dangerous and frightening unknown, which again, I think both speakers addressed. The American frontier, which separated the unknown land from the American, from the known conquered land people, furnishes then that boundary between the known and the unknown. Thus, American Gothic literature provides a precedent for presenting the American lands as a site of terror, as opposed, I would say, to the English Gothic, which often sees England as a site of domesticity, kind of comfort, and need to relocate to other mysterious countries like Italy, like Spain, like the Middle East, to the Oriental space, to find danger. Americans can find that danger right in their own landscape. In studies in classic American literature, G.H. Lawrence remarks on one particular aspect of the American protagonist who operates in this frightening landscape. Whereas the typical representation of parental authority in the English Gothic is the overwhelming overbearing tyrannical patriarch, the situation of the American protagonist reflects the cultural and historical realities of the absent king and aristocracy. Parents are curiously missing from the American Gothic text. In Lawrence's terms, Americans are masterless, having thrown off the yokes of European authority. Yet Lawrence asserts Americans find the state of masterlessness to be terrifying. It's scary to not have guidance, to not have rules. By invoking the American Gothic, Millet's Children's Bible, again 2020, turns to a tradition that sets up much of the dynamics of her novel of environmental cataclysm. A young generation forced to deal with a dangerous landscape as a consequence of the actions or inactions of a corrupt older generation. On first reading, the Gothic context of Children's Bible may not be fully evident. And I was interested in what Christy noted was the appearance all over the place of Gothic elements when you start to see them and start looking for them. So the line between Gothic and other literature is also a boundary that is typically blurred. So the Gothic is less obvious in Millet's novel than, for example, the biblical narrative, which is indicated by the title, the literary mode that seems to subsume the novel. However, a close reading of Children's Bible reveals how fully Millet taps into the influence of the American Gothic. And in fact, by looking at this text through that lens, revealed very interesting, more things to me. I've taught the text a couple of times already, and looking through this lens really revealed more to me about this text. Millet clearly gestures towards the American Gothic trope of the absent parents in delineating the woefully neglectful parents of her book. The situation of the young protagonist set loose in a dangerous wilderness echoes the masterlessness that Lawrence noted in early American literature. This pattern works to explain one of the oddities of the Children's Bible, which seemingly adheres to realism in plot and character. All of the parents of the young protagonist are outrageously self-centered and neglectful of their children. Even acknowledging the models of archaic bad parenting to be found in conventional Gothic, and taking into account the extremes of life and literature in the 21st century America, and factoring in typical adolescent disdain for forebears, Millet's parents out-Herod Herod in their egregious neglect of their offspring. When crisis in the form of apocalyptic storm looms, the parents, all of whom are identified as respectable members of the professional class, remain focused on themselves and their pleasures. Once disaster hits, they mitigate their despair by engaging in group sex, as described by their children, writhing and moaning all over the place. The water keeps pouring in, and they just smile and stroke each other's junk. Additionally, the parents demonstrate their selfish irresponsibility by turning to drugs to escape. Once the child sees two of the mothers snorting lines of coke in the bathroom. Meanwhile, the stoned fathers lie on their backs, pontificating about solutions to their problems. In the middle of the disaster, the children discover that during the night, the older generation had dosed itself with ecstasy, leading the children to conclude that their elders had, quote, ascended new heights of repulse. Of course, this vacation begins as a reunion of a group of college friends. Alcohol also plays a factor. The parents continue to drink to excess as disaster looms. As they're preparing frantically for the coming storm, Eve comes upon her mother, quote, kneeling in front of a liquor cabinet as though before an altar. We could also use bourbon, sherry, vodka, and vermouth, she told herself. Eve, waved at her since we hadn't seen each other in days. She saw me but ignored me completely. Later, when the vacation house is badly damaged and Eve returns, the children retreat to flooded ground, and then Eve returns back to the house. She hears someone calling her name. My mother. Jack having fun, she asked. Fun? Turned out what she really wanted was for me to refill her glass. In fact, the neglect epitomized by these episodes, neglect of their children, neglect of the health of the world, is the parent's great sin and places them firmly in the model of the absent parent of the American Gothic. Ultimately, the children indict the parents. We blame you for everything. You gave up the world. Ultimately, Millet disposes of the parents by using the Gothic trope of literalization. The distant parents fade away and then completely disappear, never to return, thus accomplishing not just an echo of the American Gothic, but also a reenactment of the fantasy conclusions of the English Gothic, in which powerful patriarchs are overthrown. But their absence has little effect on the kids who, as young independent Americans, seize the opportunity afforded by their myth. Millet also gestures towards the American Gothic in her reinvention of the trope of uncharted and mysterious lands. Like their American Gothic protagonists who find themselves in the untamed wilderness rather than in labyrinthine castles, the children have to face the challenge of an uncharted. The difference is that in Millet's novel, the land has been transformed by torrential rains and flooding. Millet does gesture to the space of the conventional English Gothic novel. We first meet the main characters and their parents in a grand vacation house that they rent by pooling their economic resources. Millet takes the time to remind us that, quote, the great house had been built by greedy robber barons in the 19th century. The house contains furnishings like a long table fit for a king. The narrative and the young American protagonists soon flee the damaged and uninhabitable grand house and spend much of the time on the road, traveling through a newly unnatural natural world while the parents remain in the old house. The children first move out of the house into a tree house that holds them above the flooded land. They then steal their parents' vehicles, take to the road where they find temporary refuge in a farm. The journey from the farm takes them through a new, unrecognizable world. Electric lines are down, dead animals line the muddy road. Workers try to address the unmeetable challenge of the world, or at least the infrastructure. Eve notes, quote, the land had a different texture, old and tired. The new land that frightened but also excited the American writers of the 18th and 19th centuries has been destroyed by its pioneering colonists. Fittingly, this Gothic flight from danger to security ends in the American equivalent of paradise, the extravagant mansion of one of the parents, a movie director, quote, a fairy tale castle, a giant frilly white house that looked like a fake version of someplace in Europe, maybe Italy. But as the disaster unfolds, this respite ends, and the children realize that they will need to become new pioneers and start to learn about seeds and crop plants. Millet also gestures to the elemental Gothic struggle between absolute good and absolute unknowable evil. While the new natural world of Children's Bible exemplifies the unknown, unlike the natural world of Charles Brockden Brown, the natural world that Millet constructs is new, mysterious, and dangerous, but morally neutral. The full force of the storm lacks the frightening Gothic pyrotechnics of thunder and lightning. The major damage to the grand house is caused rather prosaically by the branch of a giant tree crashing through the roof, allowing in torrents of water. But the tree and the others that fall over the course of the storm are not malevolent causes of destruction. They too are victims. Eve wakes from a dream and, quote, thought that the forest was groaning. Millet turns to human beings to provide the absolute evil that so often challenges the young Gothic protagonist. The invasion of an armed civilian militia, how American, interrupts the second idol of the book, the stay at the farm. With the entrance of the men with guns, Millet's story develops from the adventure story of young people that characterizes so much of early American fiction into something more darkly Gothic, featuring graphic violence and brutality. With the entrance of the men with guns, the face of human evil, Millett also fully consolidates the biblical allusions of her narrative. In fact, the central episode of the book, the struggle between good and evil on the American homestead, requires and insists on an awareness of the biblical context to be fully appreciated and understood. A discussion of the biblical context of children's Bible by no means pushes the text from its Gothic context. Recent Gothic scholars have been beginning to note the strong connection between the biblical narratives and Gothic literature. To point out just a few, both address the conflict between absolute and evil, good and evil. Both invoke the supernatural and the sublime as forms of meaning, gesturing beyond the human. Both consider issues of property possession, patriarchy, and its dysfunctions. The intertextual, and there are more, the intertextual web that Millett weaves between the modes of Gothic literature and biblical literature provides a fitting contextual web for her narratives of environmental apocalypse. Throughout the narrative arc of her novel, Millett turns to biblical patterns to inform her epic of climate apocalypse. These biblical patterns frequently invoke familiar Gothic tropes and conventions, and I'm hoping you'll see them and we can also discuss that later too. I don't want to point overtly every time we hit on a Gothic trope within the Bible. While Millett's evocation of the Gothic is subtle enough to require readerly intervention, she quite explicitly alludes to biblical imagery and narrative. Her novel insists that the reader approach through this lens. In fact, without the biblical context, the novel loses some of its meaning. Much of the biblical context is foregrounded by the title book, A Child's Bible, stories from the Old and New Testament, given by one of the mothers to Jack, the younger brother of the narrative. Since the two children have no religious education, it is news to both that Eve, the narrator, bears the name of, quote, a biblical lady who really liked fruit. And Christy, I was thinking how your garden also, old gardens evoke Eden. The novel, like the Bible, begins in Eden, a summer country, but this Eden also is a paradise that's turned into hell. Like the Bible, the novel moves inexorably to the end times. A major biblical episode following the story of Adam and Eve and the fall is the story of Cain killing his brother Abel. And I won't go into the interesting details. This is a peripheral story in the novel that just sort of is there for no seeming reason unless you think of Adam and Eve. So the story in the novel itself is there are two 10-year-old twins, Kay and Amy, and Kay at one point bashes Amy over a head. So Cain and Abel, and Kay at one point is found with bones of small dead animals. And Cain, the biblical Cain, is a common hero of Gothic romance. For example, Byron's play by that name. We can discuss that also. The story of Noah that follows Cain and Abel in Genesis provides more direct context for Millett's narrative. In fact, Millett takes care to particularize the big storm, and the lake is in the yard. There were bodies in there, human and dog and bird and cow. And Jack tells Eve that, quote, we have to save the animals like Noah did. The treehouse where they find refuge is called the Ark. So Millett is not subtle in this. Immediately after the storm narrative, when the children separate themselves from the great house and from their parents, Millett shifts her narrative to echo the biblical narrative of the liberation of the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt. So here to all, I'm going to go quickly through this. The children find a blown up raft, and on it lies a small man. And this is their Moses who's going to lead them to freedom. Their Moses, like Moses the Bible, has a vision. Their Moses, whose name is Burl, sees a bush with bright orange flowers. I think we need to take off, get out of here. And although the long-term goal of the Wanderers is the movie director's mansion, the heaven of the Christian Bible, Millett's Moses Burl brings the children to a temporary Mohomi refuge, more humble promised land of the Hebrew Bible. Burl starts to climb a hill, Sinai, so that he can get cell reception, a clever updating of Moses' need for heights, and talks to the unnamed owner of the place. She said to pass along some ground rules, and they're not 10 rules, but they prohibit sex. They command being considerate of neighbors. With the advent of the refugees to the farm, Millet moves her narrative to its final grand biblical narrative, the story of Jesus. One of the mothers shows up pregnant, is taken into a barn, delivers her baby girl, dies, and the older sister of the baby becomes the virgin mother of this baby girl. And well, at the same time, everybody, including this baby, are endangered by the men with guns, who in fact take the place of the occupying Roman soldiers in the Christian Bible under the power of a cruel and sadistic, quote, governor. A grisly crucifixion scene ensues in which the soldiers use a staple gun to create stigmata in the hands and feet of one of the trail angels. A trail angel is somebody who leaves food for people on the Appalachian Trail. They were in the stable attending the birth of the dying mother. And one of these trail angels receives stigmata and is tied, dying, to a tree. In Millet's case, there's a deus ex machina, her solution out of this narrative dilemma, is literally a god from the machine. Just as it seems that the men with guns will overcome and destroy, a helicopter appears overhead and lands. From it emerges a figure, a woman. Face was calm. She was slight and old. She is the owner of the land. She is all-knowing. She is wise. She's also just, because she says about the men with guns, I'm afraid they broke the rules and will be punished. When a child questions, maybe they didn't know the rules, she responds, of course they did, little one. Everyone knows the rules. So Millet's biblical narrative concludes with a departure from the promised land of the Hebrew Bible and an arrival to the mansions of heaven promised by the Christian Bible. Millet consolidates the figure of Eve's younger brother as Jesus and allows Jack, Jesus, some powerful observations. When they get to the director's mansion, Eve says, look, see the promised land. Jack replies, we already had the promised land, reminding us that the earthly paradise is indeed gone forever. Turning to the reader, Evie speaks the final words of the novel. We call that hope, see? Yet ultimately the hope that Millet provides is bleak. The best she can offer is a world absent of human presence. Early in this novel of the death of the world, or at least the human presence in the world, Eve meditates on immortality. A material child of the 21st century, she draws on lessons from her chemistry class, that molecules can concentrate briefly in a single human body and then disperse the molecules from Julius Caesar's breath, now being breathed by everybody. So the molecules go mingling on and on, moving through us. Yet she acknowledges, that was a sad thing about my molecules. They wouldn't remember Jack. As Jack is dying, Eve comforts him with this material hope. Some other creatures will come and live here, like we did. The comets and the stars will be our eyes. While Eve gets the last word in the novel, they are tempered by Jack's final hard truths. But we won't be here to see them. It hurts not to know. We won't be here to see. Ultimately, the hope that Millet offers her reader is the cold, non-human hope of the transcendent and the sublime, the hope of the Bible and of the Gothic, rather than the human hope of contemporary young people who simply desire to live out their lives on their home planet. Thank you very much for your forbearance, and I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was amazing. That was really good. Thank you. We'll have Q&A now. Before that, 3 quick announcements from the Gothic Women team. First, very exciting news. We've just surpassed 2,500 followers on Twitter. And it's worth looking on our Twitter because Lauren's live tweeting is a thing of beauty. Just the level of detail, it's amazing. And it's useful as notes, as much as anything else, as much as a record for anything else. Second, as I said earlier, we have a blog. We're always looking for contributors. So if there's anything that you want to platform, an aspect of your research, or there's something you want to draw attention to, anything from the 18th century to the 21st century, anything tied in with Gothic women, please get in touch with us. And third, this is exciting, I can give you the date for our next event, which is 18th of July. The topic is Gothic adaptation, and we have the Eventbrite link, which we'll post into the chat. So please join us if you can on the 18th of July for Gothic adaptation, looking at everything from Frankenstein, I think Dracula's there as well, Mexican Gothic. And yes, the link Lauren has just posted in the chat there. So let's have the Q&A, typically about 20 minutes or so, but and as long as you can, we'll be delighted. Lots of ways to get involved. You can use the hand raise function. You can write a comment into the chat using a Q if it's a question, a specific question for a speaker. If it's general comment, we welcome those as well. Or feel free to turn on your camera when prompted and to verbalize your own question. So without further ado, let's open up the floor. You don't want to hear from me. I want to hear from you. We want to hear from you. And let's get this conversation going. So do we have any hands raised, any comments into the chat? I'll do my best to monitor the chat, but feel free to draw my attention to anything. I don't think we've had questions as such. Questions, queries, quibbles, conundra, concerns? And I'll shut up now, I promise. I see a hand raised there from Joan, an actual hand, old school. Joan, take it away.
Also, we're going analog. Thank you so much,
Analog.
Daniel, and thank you, Christy and Ruth, for such amazing presentations. Christy, I'm going to ask what you knew I was going to ask. Please tell me about waterways.
Well, shut me up when I say too much, but the large interactions between the works of Madame Cottin and the works of Madame de Staël, who most people have heard of, with regard to waterways and them being sites of either death occurring or people contemplating death. And basically, what I found that both women do is employ three types of waterscape. The first one in Cottin's Amélie Mansfield is so the first one for both of them is to announce that death is going to happen to the heroine. And in Amélie Mansfield, it's an icy bath of tears that her lover finds himself in, and suddenly he has this vision of her being dead. In Madame Cottin, in Madame de Staël's Corinne, Corinne visits Venice with her lover who's forbidden to her, and she has a premonition of her own death when she sees gondolas floating on the waterway and views them as coffins, which sort of interacts with Goethe before her and Byron after her, drawing on her images of floating coffins on the Venetian waterways. The second one for both of them is this idea of, as you talked about, breaking down the barriers. Nature provides the barrier and also crumbles the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead. So for Amélie Mansfield, she arrives at a sublime waterfall, and the tree that's sort of blocking her from falling across the waterfall crumbles away, and she almost falls. And as she's saved, she says, "Oh God, I wish I had fallen. Actually, I really want to die." And she later commits suicide by drowning herself in a river. And for Madame de Staël's Corinne, again, she arrives at the side of a river. It's at outside a chateau where they're having a ball, and there are lights behind her. So society's pushing her forwards towards the river. The opposite side of the river, she sees what she thinks are the ghosts of Hamlet and Ophelia and so on. And so it's almost sort of as though she's able to view the afterlife across the river, and she wants to cross the river to attain the afterlife. She chooses not to at that particular point. But then later the third deathscape appears, which is the one which permits death for both of them. For Amélie, it's drowning herself in the river. And for Corinne, at the moment of willing herself to die, she has a flashback memory to a seascape. So she finds herself on the borders of Naples, where she was walking with her lover, and there was the sublime crashing of the waves, the sort of the burning of the sand under her feet, and the moon lights up a cloud where she sees the angry faces of her father and her lover's father forbidding their union, and she sees the same cloud at the moment of dying, which is why she gets this flashback to the seascape. So that's why they end up being important. Sorry, I've spoken way too much there. But yeah, it really fascinated me, and exactly some of the things that you were describing overlapped, so much that you could have almost been talking about Madame de Staël's Corinne at certain points. So I'd love to discuss a little bit more with you, especially what you talked about the sonic seascape. Actually, I'd love to hear more about that.
Great. I see a hand raised from Ruth, an analog hand. Ruth?
Oh, yeah. So just to respond to Christy and Joan, and maybe to ask a question of Joan. Yeah, to me, I was just fascinated by the whole discussion of the beach as that liminal space between, and what Christy was just talking about, the space between earth, sea, known, unknown, life, death. And I just was thinking, to me, this is a really interesting moment of life imitating art, because I think, we're seeing that blurring of the line between this, that's very frightening and Gothic and transgressive blurring of the line between the land and the sea. And I'm sure Gothic writers, if not nature, will continue to exploit the frightening aspect of the blurring of a line that's really maintained for millennia, that is now changing drastically. Lines are very comforting. The Gothic is always transgressing lines, but the lines are comforting, and we're losing a comforting line. So thank you, Joan. I don't know if you want to address that, but
yeah, really yeah, I will. Thank you so much for referencing that, Ruth. Yeah, we are. It's literalizing, isn't it? Not just in the literal erosion of our coastal spaces, but in the erosion of those protections, those boundaries. I suppose, if going back to kind of Radcliffean language, almost kind of the protections of rationality are being destabilized, especially with things that have happened in the last week. And there are plenty of contemporary. I love that you merged those 18th century ideas with contemporary fiction so beautifully, because this is why we love the Gothic, right? Because you can read something published in the 1700s and it has these huge echoes and reverberations into the 21st century. And one that really struck me that I read recently, not explicitly Gothic, but certainly has elements of Gothic fragmentation, is Tori Peters' Detransition Baby, which is a narrative about the experiences of a trans woman that, like many of the narratives that Christy was mentioning, like the Radcliffean narratives we're all familiar with, has this moment of psychic breakdown at a beach. at the coast, this kind of reflection on this moment of precipice between living and dying that Peters uses to talk about the very specific experience of being trans in America in the 21st century. And there's a gendered dimension, I think, to the beach that I didn't manage to kind of crowbar in even though I went over, I'm so sorry. But I think we're going to increasingly be seeing authors playing with this, television makers as well. One that comes to mind is Midnight Mass, which was recently on Netflix, which very much uses the island and the beach to think through the presence of evangelicism in American culture and the isolationism of it, using the archipelago to literalize that kind of severance from the rest of the world in really quite horrifying ways. And I'm sure other people have other examples, but yeah, so increasingly pertinent now. We're getting a lot of beach Gothic, and not just because the summer's coming up.
Great, thank you so much for that. A couple of questions have come in from the chat, so I'll migrate over to the chat, and I'll read them out. I'm assuming that's what the posers, the questioners would like. So Rosie Andrews, this question is for Ruth. How does the physical environment of the landmass of the United States affect the extent to which water is central or not to the American Gothic, making it different or similar to the European Gothic tradition? That comment is in the chat, Ruth, if you want to open up the chat, or I can read it again if you like.
I think, okay, I see it. Oh, okay, interesting. Interesting. So I hope I'm interpreting your question. So I think it points to an interesting point, that part of what makes America land so Gothic is just the large size of the country, that it's unencompassable, like the Gothic castle. Nobody can really get a handle on it, and we're seeing that too, and hence the Gothic fragmentation of America. So America geographically, but Gothically, is this giant unknowable landmass. Even now that the frontier has disappeared, in Frontier Gothic, one of the writers points to how in America, there are still so many frontiers between cultures, between the known of my culture and the unknown of your culture, between the culture of evangelicals, somebody mentioned, and the culture of others of us. So within America, there still are frontiers. And yet America also has two coasts, with large coasts of water. So I don't know. I think in a way now. So I'm going to make this quick because obviously this is a whole book. But on one hand, in American Gothic, the water has an important place. I kept thinking of Melville, you know, Moby Dick when John was talking. But I think on the other hand, it's the American country itself that is the internal country that's so unknowable and undefinable and so frightening. And what to me is very interesting and important, how English Gothic is always going somewhere else to find fear and danger. In Northanger Abbey, Henry tells Catherine, don't be ridiculous. We don't have things like that happening in England. Nothing was civilized in England. But in America, nobody has to leave America. America was and is and remains frightening and Gothic. And, you know, Margaret Atwood described in her Gothic Handmaiden's Tale, America of this week. So that's it.
Thank you so much. Lots of questions in the chat bar, actually. I'll begin with Sarah Dawston's question, then I'll circle back to Hayley, just because it follows on better or more immediately. So Sarah Dawston writes, do smaller bodies of water fit into your ideas about water/seascapes? How? You mentioned Lake Geneva in Frankenstein, that there's also the scene of the creature saving a girl from a river. I believe Charlotte Smith also has poems about rivers. So that's for a question for Joan, sorry.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much. Amazing, fascinating question. Yes, I think so I have a theory about why we get slightly fewer lakes than seas and coasts. And I think it might be a post-Wordsworth thing. I think it might be something about Windermere and the lakes being so very entrenched in a very specific romantic imagination that the Gothic hasn't really had the opportunity or the ground to be able to kind of pull those forth and Gothicize them thoroughly. Saying that, there is that scene in Frankenstein and with Smith as well. There is, I was talking to Julia Champion, who I work with Lauren on the Haunted Shores project, and we were discussing how there is a small body of Swiss Gothic that comes in the wake of Villa Diodati, and you know, Frankenstein and the vampire being born on the shores of Lake Geneva, that exists in periodicals as kind of anonymous narratives that are kind of out of circulation, unpublished, but appearing in kind of penny dreadfuls, that does consider this as a kind of birthplace, a womb of Gothic energies, that I think is worth exploring. And with rivers especially, so I mentioned briefly, you've kind of got Frankenstein and Geneva, you've got Frankenstein and the Arctic seas, but I think there's a missing watery link there, which is the Thames, and it is Mary Wollstonecraft attempting to die by suicide by jumping into the Thames at this very particular point in the medical imaginary, where CPR and resuscitation was being developed and taught to people and disseminated, which absolutely blew everyone's minds, because someone could be dead and then someone who was dead could suddenly be alive. And it was impossible and bizarre and strange. And there's so much strange writing about it at this time. And Mary Wollstonecraft in particular writes in her own diaries, her own journals, about the strangeness that dead should be a complete and absolute state. And with resuscitation technology, it's become something that can be temporary. And I have no doubt in my mind, and I think it's been written about extensively by far smarter people than me, but obviously this influences the young Mary Shelley, reading her mother's journals and thinking about reanimation and thinking through Frankenstein. So yes, those waterways function in different ways, but I think all of those small waterways, those riverways and those seaways all influence this Gothic imagination. That's a very long-winded answer to your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So a bit of a queue has formed, which is great. So we'll turn to Ruth first, then Laura Kirkley, and then we've got a really good question from Hayley Braithwaite I want to come back to in the chat. So Ruth, you've got your hand raised.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, because I just want to sort of throw something in about rivers in American Gothic fiction, that just for the record and for Joan, because probably the most present moment of rivers in American Gothic fiction is in African American Gothic fiction, because in much in American history as well as in African American literature, mostly for whatever the geography, the Kentucky River functioned as the line between slavery and freedom. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin, that famous moment where Eliza's on the water flows, she's crossing the Kentucky River into Ohio, where she becomes free. In Toni Morrison, the slave who's been liberated crosses the bridge. Baby Suggs crosses the bridge, and as she is crossing the bridge from slavery to freedom, she starts to feel her heart beating. She's moving from the literal death of slavery to the life of freedom. So I just want to put that on the record.
Thank you. That's great. Over to you, Laura.
Hi, I had a question for Christy, actually. I was thinking about, we talked at the beginning of your paper about, you mentioned at the beginning of your paper, the kind of crossovers between English and French. Like, as a comparatist who works with English and French literature, I'm really sympathetic to that. But one of the things that I always kind of notice about the kind of 1780s, 90s into the kind of 1820s is that, in my perception at any rate, is that the kind of sentimental novel lasts longer on the continent. Kind of Francophone literature clings to the sentimental for a bit longer, and the Gothic kind of gets going a bit quicker on the English side of the Channel. So at the point where Austen is spoofing the Gothic, you've got someone like Isabelle de Montolieu kind of transforming her writing into a kind of a more sentimental version in translation. And so I'm just interested in where the fact that you make this point that, you know, the Gothic appears in what might otherwise be defined as sentimental novels, and what you think the line is in terms of the relationship to environment. So I was interested in particular in what you said about the kind of the metaphor of revolution and regeneration after revolution, return from exile and so on. And return from exile is reminding me a little bit of, you know, what Joan has just said about kind of return from the dead, almost like it's like crossing that boundary again in a space which has been a deathscape, you know, if you think about revolution during the terror. So I wondered whether there's something around the novel of sentiment having those kind of curated spaces, you know, Julie's garden and Eloise, and, you know, whereas it seems as though as the Gothic intrudes, there's a sense of this space being rather like Joan described, this kind of fracturing of the kind of severance of man and the environment, whether there's something about a kind of disconnect between the environments there, even though there's also a kind of sense of the women using them as a mode of protest. Is that where the kind of line is between the genres?
Possibly. I mean, I think the sentiment, I mean, until writing this, I hadn't really considered the sentimental novel in terms of Gothic imagery before. And also similarly recently for another paper at a different event, I'd started to consider women's representations of, as I mentioned very briefly, adaptation of the environment. And that latter point that you just brought up there, sorry, remind me of the very last thing that you...
It's just that sense of, in the novel Sentiment, I wonder whether it's more about kind of women being able to express themselves by curating spaces which are made sort of perfect in a way, whereas the Gothic elements all seem to involve that kind of severance of the relationship between the individual and the environment. I know you're talking about the environment being used to express hysteria or depression or fear, but there's also that sense of, you know, it's involving kind of tombs and desert landscapes and kind of a more dangerous landscape. And I suppose I wondered whether that's what happens to the environment in the sentimental novel when it becomes Gothic. Is that a fair way to think about it?
It's possible. I mean, at the same time as you're getting these women's sentimental novels, which were super, super popular, but then died in popularity very quickly, you've also got novels, and I'm trying to remember the dates, but by people like Raveroni Saint-Cyr and so I'm thinking of Paliska ou La Perversité Moderne, for example, where what we get is not so much a concentration on the environment itself or these sentimental or wild environments, but more on what machinery does to the world, and how there's one particular image which is very, it seems to be very Gothic anyway, but also sort of very influenced by the Industrial Revolution, where you see somebody squashed by a printing press. And so yeah, there is sort of very definitely sort of those trains of thought permeating in different areas in French fiction. And I think one thing that sentimental novelists perhaps try to do, or certainly succeed in doing, I don't know whether it was an intention or not, but if you look at somebody like Madame de Staël, she's trying to do multiple things at once. So you read, Corinne is quite a hefty volume, but you read certain paragraphs of it, and she's got this huge commitment to environmental praxis, where she talks about how it's really bad to be chopping down trees, and how it creates air pollution. So there's sort of also a commentary on sort of early perceptions of climate change in there as well, and how this creates an unbreathable air in areas of Italy, in which then we see these foregrounded images of death and sort of anti-revolutionary kind of ideas. So I think there's an awful lot going on at the same time, both in terms of different French texts sort of arising in response to some of the British and German Romantic and Gothic, and also a lot that women writers are doing, which has yet to be uncovered, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it feels as if the Recovery Project, certainly in French studies, is still slightly behind what's happening.
I think so. I think even the knowledge of some of the French writers like Madame de Staël, Madame Cotton, Madame de Cruden, Madame de Genlis, and so on, as early romantics, is still behind, I think, what Anglophone criticism has done for the women writers in British Romanticism, for example.
So, given that, well, someone like Wollstonecraft is responding both to Genlis and de Staël, and so, you know, there are there's obvious overlap in the way that all the writers, I think, are moving from the novel of sentiment to a novel which increasingly incorporates these Gothic elements. I mean, and I would say kind of in response to the terror, the collapse of a kind of sentimental ideal, which says, you know, essentially humans are good. We just have to put them in the right environment. We, you know, make the space right and they will flourish. And it feels as though once that hope appears to have been destroyed, all of these writers begin to, the sentimental text kind of fray with kind of Gothic energy. That's kind of always
that was the point that I wanted to pick up on from what you said earlier, actually, this notion of sort of breaking with you know, that, sorry, thinking of too many things at once, that sort of idea.
So I feel like I'm slightly hogging the question space at this point, but that's really, really fascinating. And I think, yeah, we miss a lot if we miss that the kind of the connections between the literatures of both nations.
Great, thank you both. We're just going to scroll back in the chat to 6:23 our time. Thank you to Hayley Braithwaite for being so patient with me. So this is a question for Joan and perhaps Christy also. I'm just going to read Hayley's comments here. I was wondering whether you have explored literary representations of urban riverbanks / canal banks for a Gothic lens. Although inner city waterways are aesthetically very different from the coastal scenes of Smith, Radcliffe and Shelley, I was struck by the number of similarities between the way these writers render coastlines and the descriptions of the Thames and its tributaries in the works of authors like Dickens. In the 19th century, the Thames is, for instance, often associated with death, both natural and unnatural. It's figured as London's primary connection to the empire, is a space that is drastically altered by the Industrial Revolution, etc. So this is a question about urban riverbanks and canal banks. This is for anyone, actually.
can I just jump in really quickly, because it's
Yes.
amazing question, so detailed. Please write that book. Yeah, the one that immediately jumped to my mind is in Victorian periodicals, the representation of the figure of Father Thames as this kind of strange embodiment of the River Thames, often pictured with children who represent the different tributaries and waterways of the Thames in various states of sickness and strength and disarray, often confronted by the figuration of Britannia as this kind of healing mother figure, which is this such a bizarre literalization, personification of this environmental awareness of pollution in the Thames, which people lived with and confronted in very close quarters in their day-to-day life. And I think there's something specific there about that patriarchal representation and the vulnerability of the child that gestures to a changing relationship with the natural world in the 19th century, where there's this increasing sense of a responsibility, a kind of patrilineal responsibility for the natural world, as opposed to the sense of kind of the smallness of humanity in this huge kind of terrifying untamed place. That instead that relationship switches somewhat to something that is definitely motivated by imperial and colonial thinking about kind of a patriarchal responsibility onto that perceived as other. And I think Lanny, if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I'm pretty sure in Lanny by Max Porter, there's a really strange scene with a tributary of the Thames in, I think it might be Sussex. It's definitely in kind of that bit, the home counties, where the green man as this kind of pagan god figure encounters a sunken shopping trolley in a bit of the river, and the shopping trolley is kind of imagined in mythological fantastical terms, so you get that smashing together of very modern technology with significantly older ideas about the natural world. So yeah, I hope they're useful. They're the two that came to mind.
Great, thank you for that great question. I'm not seeing any hands raised or any further questions, apart from a really good question that's coming from Marilyn Malia, and Deborah as well. Let's hear from you, Deborah. Then we'll have a question from Marilyn in the chat. It does bring things together quite nicely, actually. But Deborah, you've been very patient with us.
Sorry, and feel free to answer this very, very quickly. But Christy, I was looking at the engravings on your slide, and I was just kind of wondering if you could say a little bit about like what illustration does to our response to these scenes, or whether it kind of draws attention to certain things or shifts it. And I thought perhaps that might connect, Ruth, to the children's Bible, and the idea of the Bible itself as like a series of stories with pictures, I think is how it's described. But yes, I was thinking about illustration in general and how it might affect our response to Gothic environments, if anyone wants to take that up.
That's a really great question. Until I started presenting on some of these novels at conferences, I didn't pay that much attention to the pictures that were in the novels until I wanted to put them on slides. And then I realized that the ones that come up very, very frequently tend to be the ones that focus on particular aspects of nature, or areas that we might not necessarily have expected to see sort of hitherto, this production of these novels. So with Malvina, for example, you see that garden madhouse, which is sort of intramuros, within the walls, of a healing space, which is, at the time what was happening with thinking about curing mental illness. You also see, what you tend to see is the fashionable spaces, I think. So you also see the wild romanticism, the interlinks with Ossian, for example, in some of Styles and Cotton's novels. So you see from at one aspect of one point of Malvina, she's walking through this wild Scottish countryside, and she sees a blind man walking on a mountain, and she thinks, oh, it looks just like Ossian. And so you get an engraving of that. The notion of the beyond and the unknowable and the mysterious, again, you get contemporary fascination at the time with the Orient and exploration and travel, and you get those paintings and those engravings within the novels as well. So you see the Orientalism combined with the tomb. You also see there's a really great engraving that I've used multiple times on slides now of Elizabeth dressed in this elaborate Eastern Russian costume, which again must have been really fascinating for French readers of the time who'd never traveled sort of further east than Strasbourg, for example. So yeah, that is that kind of imagery, exactly the kind of thing that I'm looking for to talk about, that people were fascinated with seeing. And those are the types of things that come up frequently in the engravings. And those are the things that certainly the female painters that I've looked at who engage with the novels of these women writers tend to be reflecting in the art that they put forward in salons as well.
Great, thank you. We'll hear from Ruth, and then I'll read out Marilyn's question, and then we'll draw to a close. Ruth?
Yeah, I just want to briefly respond to Deborah's comment on and I want to thank you, because you made me think of something that I really hadn't yet, which is that biblical illusion just provides a shorthand to visuals, not just because of whoever's grown up with any children's Bible that are always illustrated, but to much of the art of the Western canon, which is illustrations of the stories of the Bible. And so, you know, we think of Adam and Eve, and we suddenly think of a million pictures we've seen of Adam and Eve in visual representation. So thank you.
Christy, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of jump on two things that just sparked in my head, one from Ruth and one from Laura from a few minutes ago. One thing that I was trying to articulate when Laura was asking some questions was how the women writers engage with the question of deep versus shallow ecology, and that notion of stewardship versus and sort of in separation of mankind and nature, and how that actually has its origins in biblical discussion with the idea of man's dominion, man's stewardship over nature. And I just wondered if that sort of question, that sort of eco element, the deep versus shallow ecology, was something that comes across in the works that Ruth's analysing.
Great, thank you so much for that. So final question, which came in 20 minutes ago. Thank you for your patience, Marilyn. And I think you're in Malta, if I remember rightly. So Marilyn's question for Joan, but actually I think it might apply to everyone actually. So this is in the chat. The Gothic aquatic abyss is often conflated with the romantic sublime, especially by French critics who tend to downplay the role of the Gothic. How would you draw out the specificity of the Gothic in this respect? You mentioned Gothic fragmentation versus romantic harmonious relations with the natural world. Are there other ways of distinguishing them, or should we think in terms of Gothic romantic imagination? So that's for Joan specifically, but I think it might be open to everyone actually.
That's the question, isn't it? The one that we're always wrestling with as Gothicists. Where are these distinctions and overlaps with romanticism? When is it useful to note the similarities and the parallels? When is it useful to say this is a point of departure? Especially as I think I wanted to talk about it more, but when the natural world in particular is so deeply associated and entrenched with romantic criticism and our understanding of the romantics. Yes, Lauren, everything is Gothic. I fully agree. I think in my work, one way I've wrestled with this, so yes, as you mentioned, I think romanticism emphasizes our harmonious relationship with the natural world, and the Gothic potentially fragments that relationship, so seeing humankind as separated or severed from nature, or in some ways, when nature is a violent and frightening place, it's a threat onto humankind. And I think that something that the Gothic can do, that which is really productive for us, is seeing us as damaging and dangerous to nature, which we see a lot in industrial Gothic fiction in particular. I'm thinking of the polluted riverways, again, riverways in Dickens and Hard Times, mine shafts being imagined as kind of punctures into the body of the landscape. And I think the other way I conceive of it is that romanticization of the landscape and noting, you know, all of those important nuanced distinctions between romanticization and the romantics. But I think that's something that often happens with the landscape, is it is an erasure or an obliteration or an obscuring of the real lived realities of the people in those spaces and the traumas that they encounter. And I think something useful the Gothic can do is by relocating lived experience within that natural world. And it's something Blue Humanities has faced criticism for, the idea of reducing the seascape to metaphor, to just surface. And I think a good way that the Gothic can work in combination with the Blue Humanities is by noting that seas and coasts are places where people live and work, are killed, are harmed, are drowned. So I suppose that's my other kind of counter to where the Gothic differs. I think it's very much about using or locating trauma in the landscape in a way that's hopefully productive. But I imagine there are, Christy and Ruth have many thoughts on this as well.
What are your thoughts, Ruth?
Sorry. I think, you know, when I think about the relationship between the human and nature in the Gothic, I think of more of a narcissistic relationship where the Gothic subject, like the romantic subject, encompasses the world. And if it's dark and stormy outside, that's because the human protagonist is having a dark and stormy night. And you know, Ruskin's pathetic fallacy, which I thought I'd bring in and I didn't, now comes into play. This notion that the human, and of course, this, I won't talk about the Bible and Adam, but this sense of the human encompassing the world, this romantic sense of the human encompassing the world, is what has gotten us into all this trouble. So that's just, I think, another way of looking at the relationship.
Great. I think that's a great place to end, actually. So we'll carry on these conversations over Twitter, on our blogosphere. If you're willing and able at this stage, feel free to turn on your cameras or your audio as we congratulate our speakers for great papers and just as strong in the Q&A as well. So thank you so much. But feel free to give us a wave, give us a loud, rapturous round of applause. But thank you so much to Joan, Ruth, and to Christy, and from all of the Gothic Women team. Thank you for joining us. I hope to see you on the 18th of July for Gothic Adaptation.